Johnny Appleseed. If you're like me, you learned about him in elementary school alongside some mythical figures like Paul Bunyan and Babe the Big Blue Ox. But Johnny Appleseed was a real guy, John Chapman, and his real life is even crazier than the myth. There will be a big plot twist, and if you think you know what it is, I can guarantee you don't, unless you're a historian who's done some very specific archival work. Stay tuned till the end, you're gonna like it. In my ongoing effort to bring new information about American agriculture to the public, let's dig in to Johnny Appleseed. I'm starting to sound like a newscaster, ew. The Johnny Appleseed that American kids grew up hearing about in school was almost like a cartoon character. He was this guy who just kind of like lived in the woods, wore a pot on his head as a hat, and planted lots of apple trees. That's all basically true, it just leaves out a lot of other interesting information. Who was this guy? Where'd he come from? Why was he wandering around the woods planting apples? What's up with that? What was his vision? What was his motivation? In the last decade or two, there's been a lot more behind the legends storytelling about John Chapman. Folks have started talking about how he belonged to a funky little religion or spiritual sect called Swedenborgianism. He kind of had some offbeat spiritual beliefs, and maybe that helps explain some of his eccentric behavior. And folks have also started talking about what kinds of apples he was planting and why. The apples we eat today are grafted. Every single Honeycrisp or Gala or Golden Delicious that you eat, they're all clones of the same original parent tree. Because when you plant an apple seed, that seed will grow up into a tree that's usually nothing like its parents. The fruit might be larger or smaller, bitter or sweeter or more sour. You just don't know what you're going to get. So when we're raising apples to eat, we want to make sure that they're going to be good quality fruit. So we find a tree that makes really good fruit and we cut a little twig off of it and we graft it into another tree. Because we know that that twig will grow up to make fruit exactly like its mother tree. There's no guesswork there. And grafting fruit trees like that is not a new idea. We've been doing it for hundreds or thousands of years. But that's not what John Chapman was doing. He was planting apple seeds. That's why they called him Johnny Appleseed. That was a weird thing to do even back then. So that brings us to the question, why would he do that? What was Johnny Appleseed up to? Well, the reason for that is, a lot of the apples back in John Chapman's time were not used for eating like we do today. They were used to make cider. That was the biggest use for them. And cider apples versus eating apples are kind of like wine grapes versus eaten grapes. If it's a fruit you're going to eat, you're looking for a certain texture and you're looking for a lot of sweetness and enough acid to kind of balance out the flavor. But if you're using them to make alcohol, the amount of sugar, acid, other flavor compounds, and especially tannins need to be different. Cider apples tend to be a lot more sour than the apples we eat, and they also tend to be kind of bitter because of the tannins in there, which is a good thing if you're making alcohol, but not if you're going to eat them. And because it's okay for cider apples to be sour, bitter, have a lot of tannins, and it's okay if their texture is kind of mushy because you're not going to eat them anyway, you're supposed to crush them, so actually mushy is good. If you're going to use apples for cider, it's okay to plant seeds. You don't need a specific eating fruit quality. Pretty much however the tree decides to grow up and whatever fruit it decides to make is gonna work. So you might as well just plant seeds. So that's what John Chapman did. And as a business model, planting seeds worked really well because he's traveling long distance. If you're trying to transport grafted fruit trees, they're not going to make it. They're really delicate. They're probably not going to survive long trips potted up in a canoe very well. If you're trying to move apples long distance and plant them far away from towns where people already have apple trees, then seeds are the way to go. So that is why Johnny Appleseed planted apple seeds, because it worked for his business model. We should talk about that business model. During John Chapman's time, the US was a young country and settlers were just moving over the Appalachian Mountains into the Ohio Valley. This was high quality farmland and people wanted it. They wanted to move out there, but it was far away from the ports and towns where you could buy things. And so if you wanted to move out there, you had to be ready to make a lot of your own supplies instead of buying them from somebody nearby, because there might not be anybody nearby who were making the things you need. And cider and vinegar were a couple of the basic home products that you'd have to make yourself. And apples were some of the best things to make those from. Apple trees that make fruit for eating can be very high maintenance, but apple trees that make fruit for cider and vinegar are very low maintenance. They're very homesteader friendly. You can just kind of leave the trees alone all year long and pick the fruit in the fall when you need it. And any fruit you don't use is just good for fattening hogs in the fall. So young apple trees were part of the homesteader starter pack. You need basic things like a log cabin, a cow, some chickens, pots and pans, and some cider trees. And that meant that as this flood of settlers was coming west into the Ohio Valley, there was going to be a massive demand for baby apple trees. And John Chapman knew that was an opportunity. If he could be there selling young apple trees to new settlers, he could make some cash. Now here's the hitch. We just talked about how it's hard to move baby apple trees across long distance, but it's easy to bring seeds. And so if he could get in there and start planting baby apple trees a couple of years before settlers arrived, then he would be the only source of apple trees for all those people in the area. He could charge a good price and people would be happy to pay it because they could buy trees that were already 2 or 3 or 4 years old and bear fruit a lot sooner than if they took apple seeds with them and planted them themselves. So that is Johnny Appleseed's plot twist 1. And if you like this video, if you feel feel like you're learning something, go ahead and give it a like, subscribe, a comment. It really does help the video get out in front of more people. Appreciate it. And thanks for watching. The folksy cartoon character, living in the woods, barefoot with a pot on his head, was a very savvy businessman. He gamed out exactly where settlers were going to be in 2 to 5 years' time, got in there first, planted apple orchards, and sold baby trees to new settlers at a considerable markup. By the end of his life, John Chapman had made enough money to buy 1,200 acres of prime farmland in the Ohio Valley and started flipping it. So that's what they don't tell you in elementary school. This wacky frontier figure, underneath all the eccentricity, was a very savvy businessman. When you see a guy who's running around barefoot in the woods with a pot on his head, you don't think to yourself, ooh, I bet he's got bank. Maybe that's why people do that sometimes. I feel like at least some of why he did this was to just hide the fact that he was wealthy. Not because he was an eccentric spiritualist, it's because he was trying to build a brand and get known. And it's funny too, because I've told this story to a few people. I was surprised how often they respond with, but no, he acted weird because he was in this interesting frontier religious sect. And it really made me realize maybe that was a big advantage of growing up Mormon. Some people think you have to pick and choose between believing in a weird frontier religious sect or being a land speculator. Growing up Mormon is great for teaching you that you can do both. This is America. We can have it all. So apples planted from seeds are not great for eating most of the time, but they are good for cider and they're good for vinegar. And there's also some lesser known things they're good for, like curing meat and dyeing fabric. For curing and preserving meat, there are lots of ways to do it. One of them is you can add in some fruit that are high in acid and tannins. You still have to dry, salt, smoke the meat, or all three to finish the curing process, but adding the fruit can help a lot, especially if you don't have a lot of access to salt because, for example, you're really far inland and far away from the sea. The acid from the fruit can reduce the pH and make it harder for microbes to grow in there. And tannins can also help because they're a little bit antimicrobial. Fruit that has a lot of acid and or tannins in it is also helpful for dyeing fabric because a lot of the dyes that were used early on needed those co-ingredients to get all the dye chemistry to get to the right color and lock into the fabric. That's especially true for a really popular dye from back then called red madder. That's M-A-D-D-E-R. It's the root of a plant that could be used to do anything from pale rosy pink through a coral all the way to bright scarlet red. That's the dye that they used to get the bright red in the British military uniform, to dye the redcoats red. I guess nowadays it's really easy to think you can only get a color that bright from artificial and synthetic dyes, but the root of the red madder plant makes a really, really bright, deep red, and it was incredibly popular back then for making that red color. So the extra background story that some of us may have heard about John Chapman and why he planted these seedling apple trees really focuses on cider and vinegar, but those were not the only uses for these trees. There were a lot of people who also used these trees to cure meats, preserve food for the winter, and dye fabric, and honestly helped play a role in the international trade of fabrics and dye materials at this time. Now here's the plot twist. Most of the people who were planting big groves of apples from seed to use their fruit for curing meat, preserving food for the winter, and dyeing fabric were not European settlers. It was the tribes and nations living from the Appalachian Mountains through the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. So now let's talk about what all happened there and what it has to do with good old Johnny Appleseed. When we think about America's farm history, most of us probably don't think about native tribes planting big orchards of fruit trees. After all, didn't those trees come from Europe? That doesn't make sense. Well, here's what happened. When people in the United States think about Europeans settling North America, we usually think about our nation's history. We started from this narrow strip of colonies on the eastern seaboard and gradually worked our way west. Well, here's the thing. Those English settlers on the East Coast were not the first Europeans in North America by a long shot. The Spanish were trekking around the South, Florida, the Carolinas, and Louisiana in the 1500s. And the French were a really heavy presence coming in both from the Great Lakes and through the Mississippi Valley starting in the 1600s. French Jesuits were running missions all along the Great Lakes and keeping detailed, extensive diaries and records of all the things they did and saw, including big orchards of apple, peach, and other imported European fruit trees. In 1675 and 76, a Jesuit named Henry Nouvelle described the fine apple trees that lined the riverways along Lake Erie. These lands had great tracts covered with, quote, wild apple trees, which may just mean seedlings, that offered Indians ample supplies of fresh fruit. The trees were planted at the confluence of rivers and streams where the soil was fertile and the water supply plentiful. It says wild in the text, they probably mean seedlings. When Jesuits finally ventured along the Ohio River in the mid-18th century, apple and peach orchards were a common feature of the landscape. Indian women planted and cultivated European fruit trees before the first Europeans set foot on Ohio Valley lands. Florida Indians secured peach pits from 16th century Spanish priests and traded them to northern villages. Lenape or Delaware women planted the first peach trees in the Delaware region. Early Swedish travelers commented on the wild peaches they found growing in abundance along the Delaware River Valley. Again, probably not wild, they just didn't think people had planted them. When we talk about indigenous agriculture in North America, we really kind of fixate on the corn, squash, and beans part, but they were doing a lot more than that. They managed forests to make sure that they would have bumper crops of nuts, things like chestnuts, hazelnuts, hickories, walnuts, butternuts, pecans, which grow a lot further north than you would think, and even acorns. North America also has a lot of native fruit trees in its forests. We've got American persimmons, we've got pawpaws, fox grapes, and other wild grapes, and all kinds of berries, strawberries, blueberries, raspberries, blackberries, those are native here too. And people managed patches of forest to make sure they'd always have a good supply. If that's how you're already living life, if you're managing the forest to grow lots of nut and fruit trees, it's really not that weird to just add in a couple of new trees. And apples, peaches, and other imported European fruit trees fit into the system pretty well. These trees like the temperate weather of North America, and ecologically, European fruit trees like apples and peaches tend to be what we call forest edge species. They don't like to live in the deep shade inside a forest, but they don't like to be in the middle of a field all by themselves either. They do like a little bit of shelter and protection. If you're already used to managing trees for food, and you're also used to doing controlled burns to clear patches of forest and make grass meadows instead, you're already creating a lot of the places that these fruit trees like to thrive, so you might as well put them in there, and that's what people did. From the 16 to the 1800s, the French traded with tribes along the Great Lakes, Ohio Valley, and Mississippi River valleys. I want to be clear, this period was not all unicorns and rainbows. There was a lot of fighting and arms trafficking and straight up wars over control of the fur trade, and just a lot of other unsavory stuff going on. But unlike the English settlers, the French settlers did not take their land. The French settlers were not there to take giant swaths of land and fill it up with French people. They were mostly just there to get furs and take them home, which means that for about the first 200 years of European contact, a lot of native people got to keep their home and their forests. And I just want to push it home that this was not a brief flash in the pan, this was 2 centuries. That's almost the entire history of the United States as a country. And a lot of these tribes were agrarian, but that doesn't mean they just hung out at home all the time. They were traders, they had places to go. Long before cars and railroads, people were traveling long distance using rivers, streams, and lakes to get around. North America is covered with lakes and rivers that make it really easy to travel long distance by canoe. That was the preferred mode of transport, and it's part of why the fur trade became such a big business in this part of the world really early on, before any kind of mass transit existed. And because there was a good transportation network with rivers and streams, one of people's favorite tricks was, if you're going to plant an orchard, put it at the intersection of a couple of rivers or streams, because then it's easy to get to from wherever you are. And it's easy to take all the fruit that you harvested and take it wherever you need to go. If you need to take it home to your village, you can do that. But if you want to take it to a different village, if you want to take it somewhere else to trade it, it's really easy to do that too, because you're at the intersection of a couple different rivers. You've got a few different directions you can go. And it was really important to put those orchards near a river because the people taking care of them, planting them, pruning them, harvesting the fruit, it was women. For most of the tribes and nations living in eastern North America, farming was women's work, and that included taking care of fruit trees. So just imagine you're taking care of kids, you can put them in the canoe and paddle downriver, that's fine. But what you're not going to do is want to hike through the woods for 5 miles to get to the orchard. That's a little bit less feasible when you're taking care of small children. You got to be able to go to the orchard, do what you got to do, and then get back home as soon as possible. So transportation was a top priority with these things. Also, if you're hauling a lot of fruit home, it's heavy. You don't want to have to backpack that through the woods if you don't have to. So for all of these reasons, tribes had a real strong tendency to put their orchards either on an island or on the side of a lake or right at a stream or river, so you could get to it and get back. Transportation and logistics were a huge priority. I think when a lot of people nowadays think about traditional people, we don't necessarily think that they would have put a top priority on logistics and transportation, because those things don't feel very traditional to us, but they really cared about it a lot, which is just smart. Transportation's really important. I respect game when I see it. They knew what they were doing. And knowing this about where tribes like to put their orchards really helps us make sense of Johnny Appleseed's career. Let's talk about that. Miami was a tribe in the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley area. The commandant at Detroit from 1715 to 1717 described Miami women as very industrious. He also praised Indian women's agricultural transformation of Grand Island. This probably means Belle Isle, one of the 4 islands at the entrance to Detroit. They had planted an apple orchard that covered almost the entire 7 leagues of the island. Those who have seen the apples on the ground say that they lie more than half a foot thick. The apples were as large as small sweet apples, or bee apples as they called them in French. Here's that plot twist I was telling you about. As settlers from the United States poured over the Appalachian Mountains and into the Ohio Valley, they would stop at Johnny Appleseed's orchards to pick up baby trees to take home and plant on their homestead. And Johnny Appleseed's orchards were easy to get to because they were usually at the intersection of 2 rivers. Johnny Appleseed had a real knack for getting into a place 2 to 5 years before settlers got there, and and having apple trees ready to go. And his orchards were seedling trees planted from seed at the intersection of two rivers, which is exactly how the tribes who had just been pushed out of those areas ran their orchards. That's a hell of a business model, man. Now, I'm not the gambling type, but if I had to place a bet on did Johnny Appleseed plant all those orchards himself, I'd say that's an open question. Boy, there's not a nice way to say Johnny Appleseed's a thief. Now, I'm not saying Johnny Appleseed never brought apple seeds west and never planted them. I'm sure he did. But a funny thing can happen when you're out beyond the borders, beyond the frontier, and a place that none of your people know about. You can start out planting apple orchards, but then you can also realize that maybe you don't need to. They're already there. And if the people who planted those orchards, the tribes and nations who cared for them, have been kicked out by the army, and new neighbors show up 2 to 5 years later, and you tell them, this is my orchard, I planted this, would anybody know or even suspect that that's not the case? If any of those trees seem to be a little big for 2 to 5 years old, you can just blame it on, oh, the soil out here is really good. And what homesteader who just moved all the way out there because of the good soil is going to get suspicious about that answer? Folks, that's the story of Johnny Appleseed. A true American icon, maybe in more ways than we knew. Have a lovely and educational Native American Heritage Month.